This is the guidance and exemplar video to support the AS United States Foreign Policy in Asia course for the essay question, to what extent was the Korean War a diplomatic and military success for the United States? This film is to be used as exemplar in terms of your preparation or as a marking activity to go with the top sheet that supports the marking of your essays. To determine whether or not the Korean War was a military and diplomatic success, one must approach the war from both a long and short-term perspective. I must also consider that both parts of the question cannot be dealt with in isolation, as diplomatic actions or inactions can have military consequences and vice versa. Ultimately, success or failure can be determined by the objectives of both the United States diplomatic and military policies regarding Korea at the outset of the war, and as well as its pre-war military planning and diplomacy. US foreign policy regarding Korea has to be analysed within the wider long-term context of a global policy. Truman's declaration of 1947 committed the US to containing communism. The wording of his doctrine is not geographically ambiguous, but initially was directed at Greece and Turkey. This diplomatic statement led to military planning that would eventually allow NATO to be constructed. This, however, was Europe. In Asia, the military planning, as an immediate consequence of the Truman Doctrine, was the defence of several key locations. Korea, however, was not identified by the US as one of these locations. Acheson's omission of Korea in public statements had the long-term effect of both leaving the US without any recognizable plan for the defense of Korea, as well as encouraging Kim's North Korea to assume that the US would not intervene should any invasion be launched. This shows the obvious connection between diplomacy and military consequences. With the invasion of 1950, the US found itself wrong-footed without any prior planning to defend Korea, or more importantly, Japan, should Korea fall. This is a key long-term failure of both US diplomacy and military planning. Had Truman's doctrine had diplomatic credibility, surely it would have served as a deterrent to any action considered by Kim's North Korea. It did not, but also served to illustrate another failing of US diplomacy in that the US never actually recognized the war for what it was, a civil war of unification. Instead, the US interpreted the war as the opening salvo in a global game of domino theory, resulting in the US hurriedly intervening unilaterally without the initial consent of the UN. This sheds an interesting light on what the US would have done diplomatically and militarily had the UN intervention been vetoed by a Soviet presence on the UN Security Council. Wider diplomacy, however, would have a consequence. Failure to acknowledge Mao in China had led to the USSR removing itself from the UN. This facilitated the UN becoming a de facto extension of US diplomacy and foreign policy. As the dominant power in the UN, throughout the war the UN upheld the objectives of the USA. In the short term, the UN sanctioned the containment of communism by authorizing force to return the border between the two countries to the 38th parallel, and subsequent to fact approved the rollback of the communist forces to the Yalu River. All of this was carried out through due legal process, leaving us still to speculate whether the war was a UN or a US one. Up until this point, the short-term success of the US military cannot be understated. The North Koreans were halted at Pusan and then routed at Incheon. In the short term, the US confidently did well in its initial military intervention. The policy of rollback, however, failed with the intervention of Chinese volunteers, sending the UN forces south and back to the 38th parallel in disarray. This was both a diplomatic and subsequently a military failure. China had indirectly communicated its intentions through India that it would not tolerate US forces on its border. The CIA misjudged the build-up of Chinese forces, and consequently US diplomacy misread the situation and failed to guide the US to military victory. Again, long-term and short-term locked into their blinkered view of the war as part of a wider global confrontation. All of this intrigue was compounded by the confusion in the chain of command that undermined US diplomatic efforts to attempt to bring a swift conclusion to the war. MacArthur's contrary statements to Truman's undermined credible efforts to solve the war diplomatically by threatening to use nuclear weapons. Although not the most significant of points, the latter did illustrate that despite the US's preponderance in technology and weaponry, she could not bring it to bear on the Korean peninsula because ultimately the president wanted to keep the conflict contained. In this long-term respect, Truman did indeed achieve a diplomatic success at the expense of being able to deliver the desired military victory. He did indeed get his contained war. Unfortunately, he ended up with a stalemate to do that. In the long term, the US military did directly benefit from the conflict, resulting in a massive escalation in defence spending, as well as an extension of NATO to further encircle the Soviet Union with Turkey's admission. Diplomatically as well, the Truman Doctrine gained credibility, as well as that of Eisenhower, who more keenly backed rollback over containment. Ultimately, however, as stated in the introduction, the success of the war must be judged in its aims. US diplomacy failed to prevent the war, and may have even encouraged it, as neither diplomatic nor military planning had anticipated the conflict. The short-term successes of the US military in reacting to an unplanned confrontation was successful, but failed hopelessly at its more ambitious aim of rollback, despite the support and the consent of the United Nations. The US did, however, manage to contain the conflict despite MacArthur's wishes and hawks at home, resulting in a credible diplomatic policy that would be inherited and intensified by his successors. You cannot, though, separate the diplomatic and military in this conflict, as they are constantly interacting with each other.